I'll kick off. So my name is Tim Richards. I'm Technical Services Manager of the Managing General Agents Association. And on behalf of the MGAA, I'd like to welcome you to our briefing this afternoon. This is being delivered by CGI on the subject of ESG, financial and non-financial disclosures, the tipping point. Before I introduce our presenter, I'd just like to run through a few housekeeping points. So firstly, please ensure your microphone and camera are turned off. If you'd like to ask a question, feel free to use the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Time allowing, these will be asked and answered at the end of the event. If we run out of time, questions will be answered post-event. This presentation is accredited for CPD points if relevant to your ongoing professional development programme. This briefing is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be issued post-event together with the slides and our feedback survey. Please do take the time to complete our survey, which will take no longer than 2 minutes. This allows us to deliver the best possible future events to our membership. So today's briefing is on the subject of ESG financial and non-financial disclosures, the tipping point, from CGI. So let me introduce you to our presenter, William Soper. William is a senior sustainability consultant with experience in strategic benefits management, sustainable organisation change, climate risk, and experience in delivering sustainability strategies for multinational consultancies and organisations, enabling organisations to benefit from sustainability knowledge, specific training, strategic advice, training and mentoring toward a low carbon future state. So without further ado, enjoy the briefing, everyone, and over to you, William.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for the introduction, and great to be here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here at the MGAA. So to get started and to recap the learning objectives for today's session, we're going to be looking through the latest non-financial frameworks and trends when it comes to non-financial and ESG reporting. We're going to understand some of the mandatory requirements for insurers and lenders, especially with small to medium-sized businesses, and understand what kind of sustainable performance indicators, sometimes called key performance indicators, could be a warning sign for a company when it comes to non-financial investment. We're going to look at how we can apply good practice to your own strategy, but also how you can apply that high-level analysis potentially to other strategies as well. We're going to go through this in the bite-sized session, hopefully quicker than the hour. I'm more than happy to answer any questions after the session. So this slide I'm going to introduce now, and we're going to circle around to this at the end. And by the end of the session, hopefully you understand why this is really significant when you look at companies and businesses. So on screen, you have an anonymized list of 30 organizations. These are a globally leading body for net zero and ESG. And this is their carbon emissions and some of the aspects when it comes to their ESG, things like their water use, their paper use, their domestic flights. And within this leading group, only 13% by revenue typically are an actual leader who are implementing their change and embedding it in the organization. So successfully reducing carbon, the further right you go, and not reducing carbon, the further left you go. Now, I'm going to show you how you can pick this out from things like non-financial reports and what it could tell you about the long-term prospects and risks of a company in this session. So where do we start with ESG and CSR reporting? So when we talk about ESG, we're talking about 3 key pillars. The environment first, really, conserving and protecting the environment itself and its ecosystems. We talk about S, the societal aspect, so people and place, how we have adaptable, accessible and connected places for people, and the intersection of those being livable for people. Then we have the economic and governance aspects. So how do we manage our financial risks within the business, but also in our broader community and help with economic development and opportunities. So we have equitable, livable, and viable solutions. That means we have a sustainable product or business. When it comes to corporate social responsibility, we're talking about the business model itself that helps a company be socially accountable to its stakeholders and the public through ESG issues and opportunities. So these are very intrinsically linked, and they're often looked at both sides within a business, a big business. But for smaller businesses, they're often under one umbrella. So what are the drivers for this kind of legislation? Well, it's driven by entities, so the businesses themselves or organizations, the regulator, and you have the intersection of policy that really supports them. And then you have the people driving a lot of this legislation. So the rights of the consumer or the rights of the people, which is underpinned by value and trust. And this moves the regulation forward. Now, in the past year, we've seen a bit of a watershed moment when it comes to non-financial reporting and sustainability reporting. And this is because of the driving factors from all of these organizations. You look at the entities themselves like BlackRock, Unilever, who are leaders in this sector, driving change in ESG. You have the bodies in the UK, so you have the PRA and the FCA that have jointly made statements and are in consultation on new regulation around sustainability disclosure reporting. So the regulation is constantly moving forward in this space. And also within the EU, you have EFRAG, which is just mandated and focused on sustainable reporting standards. Lastly, for the people themselves and the consumers, we've seen a lot of action in the year around climate litigation. A lot of law enforcement agencies working on things like greenwashing, green hushing, and driving within public and private sector to look at the worst perpetrators and look at potential remedial action. So this year has been transformative really for the industry for non-financial reporting. So there's a lot to cover if you want to do good practice in this space. Where are we at now in the market? So in the UK, about 20% of businesses are disclosing on their non-financial aspects. It makes up about 21% of an annual strategy report. And when it's actually there, is it material and reliable enough? 81% of investors and decision makers think so. They trust the data when it's insured, when it's done by experts, to a recognized standard with the whole firm accountable and employees accountable in that process. And then the final part really is it being properly managed? So when we look at it, as I said before, 13% of businesses by revenue in that 20% have managed to have a strong performance managing these non-financial metrics, things like carbon reporting. So there's a huge part of the market that is still learning and adapting from the well-recognized standards of these leaders and starting to move along the pipeline of change. So when you look at all of these different policies, it's easy to see how you can get lost within what's going on. But I'm going to cover the high-level frameworks and well-recognized institutions that you need to be aware of. So in the EU, you've got the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the top left. Further down, many of you will recognize things like UN Sustainable Development Goals under the United Nations. And there's things like the principles of responsible investment and also for sustainable insurance. So they're all run within that body. We have things like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, things that are linked to things like Science-Based Targets Institute and net zero standards. And then in another quadrant, we have other things like the TCFD, and we have things like the GRI. And we also have more recently things like the TNFD. All of these also under a set of bodies that are starting to bring together public policy to drive change within the industry. So what we're going to cover today is where are the key players in the market now? What did they do? And what's the common link between them? So you're going to understand the existing standards we have available. So in the global insurer market, we have the Sustainable Principles of Insurance. We have the TCFD. We have the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We have the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. And there's a bit of a new arrival through the CSRD in the EU. So what we're going to cover today, though, is the TCFD more specifically and the UN SDGs, because they feature more complexity. And once that disclosure information is in the public domain, you do need to act on a plan. And in some cases, it's linking to legislation that's becoming enforceable. And this is why it's really important to get it right first time. So starting off, we're going to talk about the new legislation, which people are still trying to figure out how to do right. So this is the CSRD. This is in draft. The first draft has been issued and is being enforced. But what's key here is it takes into consideration legislation like TCFD and GRI, which are publicly available and reported on. So they're a great place to look for best practice. It institutes some really sweeping changes, but also it potentially impacts on SMEs as well. So within the EU, there will be 4 times the amount of current level reporting in order to meet this legislative requirement, including impacts on smaller to medium-sized businesses. So There is a leeway with this rule. There is an opt-out clause for the first 2 years from 2025 onwards, but it is a good one to have visibility of and is currently moving forward within the market. But underneath this, we talked about the TCFD being a component of that. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, because it covers a lot of the central themes of how we've developed our legislation. So it was developed in 2019 with the Financial Stability Board, and it covers a lot of the guidance you need for climate disclosure risk, but has good best practices across a number of other areas. It also is the stepping stone for the UK government building its sustainability disclosure requirements to be the world's first net zero line financial centre. So TCFD recommendations are foundation for these requirements, and they've been mandatory since 2021. So there are lots of reports and findings based on these reports in circulation. It's increasingly adopted across the industry as well, so very helpful for us. When it comes to an insurance company and an asset owner, they also identify the areas you need to look at and that are recommended. Provides an area like strategy, where you need to describe your climate-related risks and opportunities, your strategy and financial planning aspects, the resilience of your company's strategy. Describe the company's processes when it comes to these risks, how you're going to manage them internally, and also encourages the use of disclosures and metrics, some of those sustainable performance indicators. You need to disclose things, if appropriate, for Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, which we'll briefly cover on this call. So this is the guidance specifically for insurance companies and asset owners. A good example of this is Vodafone's TCFD. It's a great report, but you can see this communicated quite clearly on a page. The risks identified with a time horizon, as well as the opportunities in the space. This legislation is not just about risks and issues, it's about identifying opportunities when it comes to ESG. So it can be a very powerful and beneficial tool to companies and organizations. Now, navigating this, there are a mandatory set of requirements at the moment. So premium listed insurers, standard listed equity, public interest entities, other companies with greater than 500 employees and greater than £500 million turnover. But what we've seen is a cascade. So even as recently as last October, the FCA guidance and reporting requirements yet again took a step forward, with UK asset managers and life insurers, as well as FCA regulated pension providers, providing annual entity level reports and product level reports. So if you're not reporting on it now, it's more than likely a form or variant of TCFD will be coming to you in the near future. So a wide range of disclosure factors must be looked at when it comes to the value. And what's important here is the materiality of that. And increasingly, what we find is these need to be disclosed because they are material in an organization. So when we look at the adoption in the market, we're at 20% now over a 5-year time frame. And investors, customers, 90% of them found this information insightful and very useful to them as a business. But yet only 20% have adopted this legislation so far and are seizing the opportunities when it comes to ESG reporting. So it's a good place to start in earnest and to look at your potential climate-related risks. Now, a lot of complementary frameworks in that window with TCFD that can really help you. The Global Reporting Initiative is also under the same body and has approaches for materiality, how you identify what's important to your business, your management reporting, and disclosure for a comprehensive range of sustainability issues. So it's more than likely greenhouse gas measuring will be mandatory for compliance purposes. And other tools that can help you with that are things like the Science Based Targets Initiative. They have just released guidance for the financial sector, and this year they are developing target setting methods for insurance underwriting. And you'll notice in the bottom right that the SBTI guidance is looking to align with the complementary nature of the existing frameworks, including the TCFD. So again, linking back to TCFD being a cornerstone for measuring your financial and risk management processes. The last one I'll cover as well, which is in a separate body, is the UN SDG. It's covered by the United Nations, and typically in an organization, the approach is to look at the materiality of these goals. There's 17 of them that may be applicable to an organization. An organization will normally select the ones that they feel closest to and within their stakeholders, their community. So for example, clean water and sanitation, it could be climate action, responsible production and consumption if they're a manufacturer, for instance. They'll normally select a set of primary goals and the sub-objectives under those goals, and then a secondary set of goals, which they report to annually. There are other organizations like the UN Global Compact, where you can become a signatory, guaranteeing you access to additional learning materials on this journey, but also lots of forums where these key stakeholders that can help you on this collaborative change are involved, and you can access them. So also very relevant. So we've covered a lot really in starting the journey, TCFD being a cornerstone at the moment for a lot of upcoming legislation, and the UN SDGs as well being a key part. But how can you tell you're doing well, and how can you link some of these organizations together in the different reporting standards? Well, there is one that carries throughout them, and that's what I'm going to show you today and talk you through how you can assess that. So transitional risks, when we look at the TCFD, for instance, mostly focus on things like policy and legal action. They focus on technology and the improvements around low carbon transport. They look at things like supply and demand in the market for different consumer goods based on the impacts on climate-related risks, but also opportunities in the ESG. There's also the reputational damage that can be incurred from the transition to a low carbon economy. And this is where those risks, if you have a poor non-financial strategy or ESG strategy, will start to manifest. So what we're increasingly seeing is the application of this guidance coming from bigger organizations down their value chain. They will look to engage with their partners because the shock of the issue can affect them as a bigger company. So often you'll see a sort of initial scoping document, you'll see a sustainability strategy document that's published annually. It will cover all the aspects, but they'll also say how they're working with their members to institute the change and what standards they're working to. So it's a good idea to look at the customers around you, look at the insurers or the organizations you're supporting, see what they're using, be it the UN SDGs or the TCFD or just carbon reporting against a set standard, and look for the commonality where the market's moving, because it will be pushed outwards and down. A good example of this, for instance, is recently in the NHS. Since April, they're now mandating the use of certain policies and plans that were common in the government years ago. So these notices now account for 10% of the value of a bid, for instance. So if you're not sustainable, if you don't have good CSR and social value policies, you could potentially lose business opportunities, which is why it's important to act. So what makes these risks material? There have been lots of recent studies that show that actually cumulatively it tantamount can end up at 5.43% of the share price on average when one of these ESG issues manifests. Now, roughly speaking, in the financial sector, anything around roughly 5% would be considered material traditionally. So we are just crossing the threshold where these risks need to be taken seriously. And you'll notice that even within the EU legislation at the bottom line, you can now face fines up to 5% of the annual turnover of a company, or twice the amount of the profits gained or losses avoided because of the breach. So there is teeth now in the legislation, which means companies need to act, and they need to act in the right way. So how do we address and look for commonality, and where can we start with this journey? So on screen, you'll see the three bodies that we had on the first slide. And we've got the UN SDGs there with Climate Action 13. We've got Scope 1 and 2 emissions under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And we've got in TCFD, we've got metrics and targets. So how do we disclose, measure the risks and opportunities in our company? Now, there's a common thread with all of these, which is carbon. A carbon footprint is a really good measure when it comes to the non-financials. It's voracious, it's tangible, it's manageable, and it's measurable. It interlinks with all aspects of the products, goods, and services. It's governed by aligned standards to an endpoint. And the financial market is aligned with a 2 degree or 1.5 degrees Celsius outcome, which means there's an endpoint to this goal. So it doesn't matter which framework you're selecting, it's a good common sustainable performance indicator and a good proxy for the management of that reporting. There are other common measuring tools used as well. People will have heard of things like the 5 Capital model, maybe pestle analysis or social return on investment, which are included and can also be used. But between these frameworks, carbon is a common measurable aspect. I'm going to show you what that can look like in a non-financial strategy. So to understand carbon, we're going to cover it at a very quick high level. So scope 1 is everything that your operations are needed, everything your company needs to do day to day. So your company's facilities, your vehicles, etc. Scope 2 is the lights in this room above me that are being powered. They come from a utilities provider. So all of those carbon emissions are scope 2. And anything like the train I took into work today that people dialing in on this call are using the carbon footprint of their devices, that might be considered as scope 3. So upstream and downstream activities related to your overall business function. So really what we got is an internal measure and an external measure, a non-financial measure. And we can link that very clearly in non-financial strategy. It's a good proxy indicator. So through scope 1 and carbon reporting, we can see what's happening internally in a business. How are they controlling their operational emissions and actually their business services? And externally, it's a good indicator of how much they're engaging with their suppliers, their customers, their partners, how they're making sure that their value chain is fit for purpose in the future in a low carbon economy, which is coming by 2030, 2050 in the UK. So the maturity of this data from a non-financial perspective can also be used alongside financial information to look at the long-term prospects and risks in a business. So it's a great indicator. I'm going to break it down and show an example. So on screen, you can see a supplier, a company, a customer, and maybe an insurer tied to a company, and then the utilities that supply energy in the background as boxes. What we're going to show is the carbon overlaid. So transitioning between these two, you see the company is scope 1, that's its operations. Scope 2 is the utilities, put simply, and scope 3 is everything in its value chain. And the insurer is supporting this web. So if scope 1 indicators are moving out and carbon's going up, well, the processes aren't decarbonized, they're resource intensive. Are they going to survive the next 10, 20, 30 years? Scope 2 is how much consumption have you got when it comes to energy? Are you managing the right policies and processes, energy reduction initiatives, cost reduction initiatives in the company to keep the business running smoothly? And scope 3 is incredibly valuable because it shows if your businesses, employees, partners are engaged with that company and moving towards a low carbon economy. So now that we talked briefly through all of this, when it comes to reporting and the carbon baseline, we're going to go back to our example. So taking ourselves back, we talked about the 30 organizations on the screen with carbon, and we looked through their non-financial reports as to what they're doing. We have greenhouse gas in red. So at the top, you've got the worst when it comes to carbon. At the bottom, you've got the best. They've reduced their carbon. And we're going to zoom in on the bottom leaders for a second. Now, on screen, I've marked it up. Scope 1 and 2 is your greenhouse gas change on the year. So you can see they've both reduced. But one organization is actually engaging with its external partners. It's looking at its domestic flights, its water consumption, its water and waste, its paper use, and they've got some good indicators. So how resilient are they? How resilient is the bottom organization, which is much better on the carbon, but doesn't report on any of these facets? Well, if I was going to do a quick assessment from a non-financial perspective, I'd say, well, the top shows evidence that they actually have acted in some areas of improvement around their employee habits, except for maybe in domestic flights, and that's an area of improvement. So they're relatively mature, likely within their non-financial and sustainability reporting strategy. They also likely have a much lower risk. Whereas when I look at the bottom, we've only got scope 1 and 2. And considering they've reported that they're 100% more efficient than every other organization in the leading 30, you can question the veracity of that when they're not reporting on any of their partners, any of their value chain. Then we dig a little deeper. We go into what we call in the ESG sector more shadow reporting. So looking for the risks, ESG risks in a business. we can see that when we dig deeper, the top organization is very resilient when it comes to their ESG strategy. They got commitments to net zero, their supply chain's engaged, they have climate risk management, they have sustainable decision-making and ESG decision-making. They have tools embedded in their organization. They have a long-term strategy and they are succeeding as a business financially. So their business risk is low risk alongside their financials. Whereas on the bottom organization, we dig and we find none of the above. So sustainable decision-making, there's no evidence of that in their strategy. And whilst they do seem to have 100% risk reduction when it comes to carbon, they don't have any commitments with net zero. So do they have a good long-term non-financial strategy? Probably higher risk. So you can apply this both to your companies. You can also apply this to other companies. It's a great tool initially to look across regardless of framework. But there are lots of other measures, lots of other metrics, and you might be asking, well, where do I get started? So I'm going to tell you a bit about how CGI got started, and then I'm going to talk about the good best practices as a recap. So for us in CGI UK, we have a net zero program, targets and goals. We're on track to deliver our 1.5 emission reduction targets by 2026 for scope 1 and 2, and we're also engaging our supply chain. So for business travel, we have scope 3 targets, but we've also set the ambitious target with our supply chain to help them set science-based targets, 50% of them by 2026. So an example where we're able to go in and lead with our community and help them on the journey to net zero and to maximize their ESG opportunities. We then would neutralize any of our remaining emissions through offsets. And what we're doing is putting in the latest science, latest operational practices and policies to help protect the environment, but it's also about responsible business practices. This also makes cost and financial sense as much as it does ESG sense. So we are proud to have been recognised for our leadership in this area, and our Race to Net Zero programme was nominated for a Global Good Award. In terms of how we help SMEs though, you can see how the longer this goes on and at the pace that legislation is moving, you need to act now, because the curve and the requirements of this legislation require a lot of data gathering, requires a lot of thought and leadership in the space, and also probably some business changes as well to make this a success. So we do have a sustainability jumpstart that we use with our SMEs. We help new companies understand what they need to do and what exposure they have to new financial legislation. We do it in an affordable way that's more accessible, and this is also part of us being here today, is to help train and educate people on how they can be truly sustainable. We do have a rapid way of engaging with our customers and stakeholders, and it's flexible and affordable. But really, what's key for me is that we think about what good practice we have and we can apply when we go away from this meeting. So if you haven't, think about the materiality assessment. What is material to you, perhaps? What is material to other organizations or to their assets? What standards are they applying? So if they're in a web and they're all applying UN SGDs, perhaps they need to also consider TCFD. And likewise, if there are a couple of outstanding organizations that haven't looked at carbon reporting, maybe they need to. You need to show that your reporting disclosures actually link to the non-financial and financial impacts. You need to show clear evidence that sits alongside one another and they're not separate reports. Standards will be openly listed on annual disclosures along with the verification, and the metrics should be easily and simply interpreted. So the Vodafone example is a great example where you can clearly see the risks, and I would direct anyone to go have a look at their reports. CGI is also releasing its TCFD report imminently, and we would encourage you all to go have a look at that as well. Carbon baselines are a great foundation and a good starting point for any business that's looking to get on the journey, and will be uniform across a lot of this legislation. So at the end, good practice means that you'll be able to see there's an actionable plan. It's not just a statement. It's also about having the risk and financial processes in place for all aspects of ESG. So lastly, I'm going to give a couple of helpful questions. So in the future, what opportunities do you have? Maybe there are high-risk assets which could be exposed to additional tariffs and premiums in the future. The EU is thinking about things like carbon tariffs and pricing, and perhaps there are businesses that need to consider this. But also, are insurers that are leaders in this space thinking about discounts for people who are low carbon consumption businesses that have an opportunity when it comes to ESG? What assets are very low risk and could be a discount? What is the climate carbon literacy of your customer? And do the future regulations impact one of your customers? The other thing is, how far am I from acting on these? A lot of these frameworks are moving at pace. So if you're not implementing some of the recommendations of TCFD or carbon reporting, the wall that you might face later on is getting higher and higher. So think about how far is a network pool from realizing on these. For example, a carbon reduction plan for a small SME took 6 months to a year. So they need to be thinking now about future legislation. What reports are they externally publishing right now? Are they engaged with their partners? And if you want to look back, is there any history or news of public backlash? If so, how's it being managed? Not always does it go 100% right, but what's crucial with these processes is an ongoing management process to show improvement year on year. In that example, what we hope is those organizations communicate. They learn within their leading 30 group and take the best practice from the 13% and bring it to the 100%. And that's part of being in a collaborative, complex ecosystem of partners. So what organizations have been successful on their journey in your customer base, and how can you share those and communicate those learnings out? That would be a really good question to ask. So that's it from me. Just as a final recap, so hopefully now you can recognize some of the latest non-financial frameworks. You can understand the mandatory requirements when it comes to insurers and lenders. You can understand one sustainable performance indicator very thoroughly, but also maybe how you might apply it through other frameworks and what are the warning signs for a company when it comes to non-financial investment. You learned a bit about good practice when it comes to ESG and CSR reporting strategy, and also about how you apply high-level analysis to that strategy. So thank you very much for listening. I'll hand back over. Thank you.
Thanks, William. Fascinating. Really enjoyed that myself. Thank you. Just say to anybody who's got any burning questions or any questions at all, really, don't hesitate to put them into the meeting chats now. Just type them in there and we'll make sure they're asked. In the meantime, I do have a few questions already. So the first one of those, William, is what could I start with as an easy win?
Yeah, so I think the carbon baseline is a really good easy win. It's mandatory across a lot of the upcoming frameworks, and it's a good place to start to engage with stakeholders. If they haven't considered it before, what it does prompt is them to ask some of the environmental issues and consider broader ESG strategy. So it's a good place to start.
Great, thank you. And I have another one here. How much of this is publicly available?
Yeah, so all of the guidance that you need for GRI reporting, any of the reporting standards is publicly available information, which means you can access, download, and interpret it. What we often find is the barrier to acquire that knowledge can be a challenge. There are lots of communal groups as well and initiatives that you can be involved in with bigger companies that will help you on your journey towards a more sustainable future. So you can access it all, and there's lots of opportunities and communities to engage into to get to learn how to manage ESG.
Great, thank you. And I have two more actually. What would be the biggest risk you can see on the horizon? What is the largest opportunity?
Yes, so when it comes to biggest risks on the horizon, it's the rapidness of the legislation changing. So you've got so many different things moving at once and they all need to agglomerate. So some of the practices are going to be phased out and you need to keep current. The biggest risk is that you put something out there which could come back to haunt you. So when you have ESG related findings, they're now going to be published through a data disclosure form, and it's going to be kept as a digital copy potentially forever. So we need to make sure that the information we now put out there is correct, that we are comfortable what we put in the public domain. In terms of opportunities, it's a really good opportunity to demonstrate leadership in your community of partners, customers. What we see more and more is companies asking us how they can show they are sustainable, because it opens the door to conversations with new customers. So having things like a common reporting strategy, being able to engage and lead sessions with other members and suppliers and customers opens more customer conversations and more business. So those are big opportunities.
Great, thank you. And so this is the final question. So if anyone does have any more questions, please type them in now. So the last one at the moment is, what can I do if it goes wrong?
Yes, so the best thing to have in an actionable and manageable plan would be a business continuity plan alongside that. So within managing your financial and non-financial risks, it's also good to have the scenario considered where something does come out related to an ESG issue. So in good risk planning, you will have accounted for some of those areas. And if not, there are experts who can help you along the way. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. Have no other questions. So just like to wrap it up then. So thanks very much, William, for your presentation, which I'm sure everyone will agree has been very useful and very timely. So a very important presentation, I think. And thanks to every one of you for joining us. Don't forget to provide your feedback when we send you through the form for that, and look out for forthcoming MGAA events. I hope you all have a productive afternoon. Thanks again for joining us, and see you all soon.